4.01. This can be about ecology. All right, so we're going to be studying a little bit about ecology today. So ecology is basically how living things and the environment they interact, right? So it's giving us a few sample questions, right? So it says, for instance, if salmon were to disappear, how would the bears of that area adapt, right? So what is the interaction between the grizzly bears and the salmon, and how do they interact with all the all the things around them, the environment around them, the rivers, the climate, all that kind of stuff, right? That's ecology. Right. So there's a couple of key terms that they're mentioning here, right? So we have the biosphere, biome, and climate. So the biosphere, right? This basically includes all living things in the areas in which they live. So this is basically, kind of like the entire Earth is the biosphere, right? So the biosphere includes, all the living things within it, and then also, the entire space in which they live. So it says it fills an expanse of about 26,000 meters, starting 11,000 meters below sea level and rising 15,000 meters above it. So basically, like from the bottom of the ocean up to the top of the atmosphere, right? This is where living things, living organisms live, right? So this entire area is called the biosphere, right? So if we go to the next slide, right, we can take a look at, a picture of the biosphere. So the biosphere is basically like a huge area, right? So the biosphere includes the Earth, right? Because living things interact with the, with the soil and the ground below the sea level. Includes the water, includes the air, right? All of these different kinds of areas all together are called the biosphere, right? So you probably have to focus in a little bit to study, living organisms when you're studying. If you want to study something, you have to kind of focus in on a specific area within the biosphere, like the ocean or, the air or something like that. Now, this over here on the right, this is called Biosphere 2. Has anyone ever heard of this thing, Biosphere or Biosphere 2 before? Anyone know what this is? So this right over here, Biosphere 2, right? And there was Biosphere 1 before it. So this was like an attempt. You see this like structure here with like a pyramid kind of thing, and there's like some buildings and stuff like that. So this was like an attempt to kind of create kind of like a self-contained, or design kind of like a self-contained biosphere. So in it were like plants, animals, right? Like obviously water, oxygen, air, all like everything, right? It was the idea was that they wanted to kind of design kind of like a self-contained kind of biosphere where everything was in balance, right? Where the plants, different kinds of animals were all in balance, right? Like balanced amounts of predators and prey. And then in the air, right, carbon dioxide and oxygen would stay balanced. So basically, it didn't work out. Any way that they tried it, right, it always ran amok, right? Like one creature would like take over, right, and eat all the other creatures, or something like that, right? It never stayed balanced. So the whole world, right, is obviously a very, very complicated, place for the amount of oxygen in the air to stay balanced, or the amount of predators and prey in a certain area to stay balanced. So it's very difficult for someone to kind of design that and try to manufacture something artificial like that, right? You also have this term biomes, right? So anyone know what is a biome, right? Freya, do you remember from like 5th grade or something, like what is a biome? What is it again? All right, take a look at this one over here. All right, so what does it say? The main biomes in the world. All right, so Free has to describe for us this picture. What's going on in this picture here?
It's like at different places, it's different kinds of environments.
Right. So it's basically like, these are, each of these, biomes kind of has like a similar kind of climate and weather, right? Similar kind of climate, similar kind of vegetation and animal life, those kinds of things. So if it, for a creature to, live, somewhere, most creatures, they live in like one kind of biome. So you could kind of think of it that this is kind of like the limit of where certain types of plants and animals will live, right? Certain types of plants and animals, they need a certain environment and a certain climate in order to live. So each of these places kind of has like a similar climate and a similar kind of environment around it, similar kinds of plant and animal life within it, right? So each of these places is called a biome. So there's all different kinds of biomes. We have near the top, right? We have like the tundra, right? At the very top, that's mostly like frozen, pretty much. And you have the taiga, which I think is frozen for like much of the year, but then there's also like a good amount of vegetation and that kind of thing. You have rainforests, you have savannas, different kinds of grasslands, all different kinds of biomes, right? Deserts, right? So each of these places, right, has a similar kind of climate, similar kind of plant and animal life, right? All right, let's look at some more terms, right? So this one right here says ecosystem, right? So we have an ecosystem, right? It includes all the living things along with the physical factors of the environment, right? So the ecosystem basically includes not just the living things in an area, but also the physical factors, right? The amount of water, the soil, the different kinds of nutrients that are present in the environment, those kinds of things all together equal the ecosystem. So the ecosystem could be as small as a tree or as large as an entire forest. So this is kind of a subjective term, right? So if we go over here to the next page, right, we have an ecosystem, right? So this is kind of telling you, from largest to smallest, what these terms are. So the ecosystem includes all of these kind of, non-living, factors as well, right? So,
did I miss anything important, or is it all just like basic information?
I think we just started.
All right.
And then we have habitat, right, which is kind of like a part of the ecosystem, right? So the habitat is like a subsection within the ecosystem, right? So what does habitat mean? The habitat is a place within this ecosystem where an organism lives, right? So so basically within the ecosystem there are like multiple habitats, multiple places where organisms could live. All right, so now let's talk about communities and populations. All right, so if you look at this picture over here, this kind of tells you like how we're going to narrow things down, right? So you have the whole ecosystem, all right? You have the whole ecosystem out here on the right. And then we have a community, right? So what is a community? The community is basically all the different species and living organisms that live within the ecosystem, right? So you see the community can be made up of different kinds of species. Here we have some kind of gazelle, zebra, wildebeest, some kind of vulture, all these different kinds of creatures, all these different species, right? All together are the community of the ecosystem, right? Now, so there's a difference between community and population, right? So Anas, what do you think is the difference between community and population?
Population is a single type of organism.
Right. So in the community, you have all the different species. If you take one of those, then you have the population, right? If you take just one of those, then you have the population. All right. And then one organism is just like one member of that population, right? So so this is the difference between population and community. That's an important difference. Population is just like one species, all the organisms of one species. Community, right, is like all the different organisms in a particular area. All right. So a species, right? So the general, so we have community and population, right? So a population is made of one species. So what is a species? So a species is a group of organisms that can successfully reproduce with each other. So this is the general term for species. At least this is like a useful, one useful definition. It doesn't, there's no single definition that necessarily meets all the criteria. I mean, there's no definition that kind of fits how people use it. But this is like the most useful kind of definition. That this is it is a group of organisms that can successfully produce offspring. All right. So, for example, over here we have, this is comparing some different kinds of species, right? So, if you take a look at, these two birds over here, right? Western meadowlark and eastern meadowlark, right? So they look, almost the same. So it's very difficult to distinguish between these two types of creatures. So, however, these are actually different species. So they do not successfully produce offspring together, right? However, this butterfly, right? These two specimens are of the same species. So they look a lot more different than these two birds look, but they're actually of the same species, whereas these two birds are of different species, right? So it just says when it comes to species, appearance isn't everything, right? So we have abiotic and biotic factors, right? So Yusuf, what do you think what do you think are biotic factors, and what do you think abiotic factors are?
Brother, I think abiotic factors have to do with non-living things, I guess, and biotic factors have to do with living things.
And how did you figure that out from the words itself?
Because bio is living, or life, I guess.
Right. So anything where you have bio, right? That's something that's like living, right? And then if you put
then it's no, you know what I'm saying?
Right. So if you put a in front of something, right? Not biotic, but abiotic, it usually means the opposite of whatever that thing was, right? So you have biotic factors and abiotic factors, right? So the abiotic factors are basically all the non-living things in the environment, right? The temperature, sunlight, soil, rocks, and air, right? These are all things that are important for the organism, but they're non-living. The biotic factors are all the other living things within the organism, right? The other plants and animals, right? Here it's just providing some explanation, but there's nothing really unique there. So this picture over here just giving you some examples, right? You have the biotic factors, right? All of these different things, from microscopic organisms to plants and animals. These are all the biotic factors, right? And then the abiotic factors are all these other things that are non-living, right? So biotic, abiotic. And this is just giving you some more examples, right? Sunlight, soil, the water, abiotic, the birds, raccoons, frogs, biotic factors. All right, so everyone here knows kind of what is a food chain, right? So food chain basically means, it basically shows the transfer of energy and matter from one species to another, right, along a linear path. So when you see food chain, right, it's just going to be one, path to take, right, from the sun.
Food web gives a different,
right,
kind of it's like a web, right? It's a little kind of web.
Right. So food chain is basically you see basically one path, right, one line, right. The grass is eaten by the insects. Insects are eaten by the mouse. Mouse is eaten by the snake, right? So it's just one path to take. So matter is transferred, right? The actual substance goes from one organism to the other. And within that substance, there's also energy that came from the sun, right? The sun provided energy for the plants. So within the plants, remember all those things we were talking about before, cellular respiration, glucose, all that stuff, right? The glucose, the sugar that's produced, has within it stored energy. So at each step, some energy is released, right? So the insect eats it and takes some of the energy. The mouse eats the insect and takes some of the energy. The snake eats the mouse and takes some of the energy, right? So now, basically, there's different levels, right? You see how basically the sun goes to the producer, the plants, right? So this is one level. Then the next level is like the first consumer, the first one who eats something. Then the next consumer, then the next consumer, right? You see how there's like different levels, right? So each of these levels is called a trophic level. Each of these organisms exists within what is called a trophic level, right? So we'll take a look at some pictures of the trophic level. So just keep that in mind. We'll take a look at some pictures. All right, so we have the food chain on the left, right? You see in the food chain, right? Basically the energy and matter follows one path, all right? You have basically one set of arrows, right? In the food web, right, you have like multiple, so the food web is more realistic, right? Because it's not just like one thing eats the other and only one thing eats that and only one thing eats that, right? It's all like much more complicated, right? So basically the food web is kind of like more realistic, like what's happening out in the world, right? Now, this next pyramid shows the trophic levels, right? So basically here's the idea, right? The sun gives energy to the producers at the bottom, right? Then you have the primary consumer, right? So the primary consumer is like the first consumer, the first one that eats the plants. Then the secondary consumer eats the primary consumer, and so on, right? To the tertiary consumer. There could be other levels as well. But this is kind of like showing this, right? So basically, matter, right, like substance, is transferred from one level to the next, to the next, to the next. It also shows energy being transferred up, right? 2,000 kilocalories per year, right? Up to 200, right? From here, 20. From here, 2, right? So what do you notice, Fariha, about the energy? Is there anything that you notice about the energy that's being transferred up from one level to the next level, to the next level, to the next level?
Yeah.
All right, what do you... You go ahead, what do you notice?
Is it going 100? Like it's getting less.
Yes, it's getting less and less and less, right? So Anas, why do you think that is? Like, how come, so these plants, let's say, have 2,000 kilocalories within it, right? So is that going to transfer to 2,000 useful kilocalories in the primary consumers? Anas, are you there?
Wait, what?
So we're talking about the amount of energy, right? So you see the energy is decreasing.
I know if you weren't listening, were you?
Right? So let's say this plant has 2,000 kilocalories, right? Is this animal going to use 2,000 kilocalories to perform work?
Okay.
So probably not, right? Like what happened?
No.
So a lot of it is wasted, right? See how a lot of it is wasted every step?
Yes.
Where does all that wasted energy go? Like how is it wasted?
It's gonna change into form or heat.
It's going to change into heat, right? So every time that let's suppose 100% of the energy, right, is transferred from one thing to the other. Like for example, let's suppose you have a battery, right, and you hook up like a lamp to it, or like a light bulb, right? If all of the energy, if 100% of the energy in the battery was transferred to the light, then that would be like 100% efficiency, right?
Yes.
But usually that's not what happens, right? You look at you feel the battery, there's heat, right? The battery gets warm. There's heat that's produced. The light bulb itself produces a lot of heat as well, right? So the energy is not always transferred 100% efficiently to the next level in order to perform work. And same thing out here in these trophic levels, right? So the plants, that's why they say that if you want to eat like a pound of meat or something like that takes a lot more energy, than to eat like a pound of vegetables, something like that, right? Because most of that energy is actually kind of wasted away as heat. All right. Any questions about this? So that's kind of the main idea. Energy is transferred, but a lot of it goes away as heat. It's not, like 100% efficient. It's like, maybe only 10%, 10%, 10%, 10% goes to the next level. All right. So we have these terms, right? There's different kinds of terms. We talked about producers, right? So saying at the first level, we have producers, right? So that's the, plants at the bottom, the producers, right? So another name for producer is called autotrophs, right? That means that they, basically synthesize their own food, right? They manufacture their own food, right? So now there's different kinds of autotrophs, right? So there's different kinds of autotrophs. There's what's called photoautotrophs and chemoautotrophs, right? So, all right, so we're going to talk about that in the next picture. But first of all, let's talk about autotrophs versus heterotrophs. So autotrophs usually are plants. Heterotrophs are usually anything that eats plants or animals, right? So anything that kind of, takes energy from somewhere else, that is not receiving energy from, that is not kind of making its own food, is called a heterotroph. Anything that makes its own food, autotroph, all right? So they use either light energy, that's usually what we think about, photosynthesis, right? Or sometimes they use chemical energy to make their own food, right? So we're going to talk about the difference between these two. Heterotrophs, they're basically taking some other living organism and they're taking it in and digesting it, all right? So these could be like animals. These could also be like mushrooms, right? Because mushrooms, they don't make their own food, right? They decompose like dead organisms. So they're also heterotrophs. All right. So let's talk about the different kinds of autotrophs, right? So again, autotrophs make their own food. But within autotrophs, there's not just plants. That's what we usually think about, plants. But there's also chemoautotrophs, right? So photoautotrophs, right? What is the, Anas, what does the term photo mean? Whenever you see the term photo, what does that mean?
Like doing photosynthesis.
Right, but what does that prefix photo mean? Photo.
I don't really know, brother.
Light, brother, light. It means light.
So light, right? So think about different words: photosynthesis, photograph, right? Stuff like that, right? So photoautotroph, they all mean light. They're all using some kind of energy from light, right? Like photograph, right? It's like capturing light, right? So photosynthesis, right? We talked about all this before, right? It takes energy from the sun and then these other things and makes food with it, right? So what are some examples? Algae near the ocean's surface, right? So anyone is going kayaking, right? You see algae near the ocean surface, right? Whether it's microscopic or you can see it, all those are capturing sunlight, right? Now chemosynthesis or chemoautotrophs, they produce energy from chemical compounds. So the most common example of this is something called archaebacteria. This is like a tiny organisms that are similar to bacteria. So they live near deep sea thermal vents. All right. Anyone know what that is? Freeha, do you know what are deep sea thermal vents? Have you heard of that before?
Deep sea thermal vents?
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, is it for the organisms in the deep sea?
Right. So in the deep sea, right? So in the deep sea, right? Have you guys seen these like things they call them like chimney smokers at the very bottom of the ocean?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, brother. Isn't that like where lava is like right there released or something?
Right.
And
so-
like instantly turns into.
Right.
Yeah.
So usually, underneath the ocean, there are actually also volcanoes, right? So most of the volcanoes, some of the volcanoes are from hot spots that form island chains, like like Hawaii, the Galapagos Islands, stuff like that, right? Those come from like volcanoes, those islands. But also at the bottom of the ocean, basically the ocean floor is like spreading. It's like it's moving apart. So wherever it moves apart, there's like a whole chain of volcanoes at the bottom of the ocean. So usually these things, these deep sea vents, these are usually near the volcanoes, right? And so basically there's like always, all of this hot water and, different kinds of sulfur compounds and different kinds of things coming out of here. And so a lot of these are supposed to be like toxic compounds, but for these organisms, you see, like, I think near here you might see some organisms. I'm not sure in this picture. But near these chimney smokers, there are different kinds of chemicals that come out that are able to be used by these organisms to produce energy, right? So these are called chemoautotrophs. They make their own food, but it comes from these chemical compounds, not from light from the sun, right? So they're making their own food, but they're utilizing the different chemical compounds that come out of the earth, like this, right? So we also talk about consumers or heterotrophs, right? So heterotrophs are anything that don't make their own food. They have to go and eat something else, all right? So it could have a mouth where where it chews and eats it, or it could be something like a mushroom that secretes different kinds of enzymes that goes out and breaks down something, and then it just sort of absorbs the nutrients that result. So you could kind of think of it as like this, as a kind of, instead of having a stomach inside that secretes acids and enzymes that breaks down food, it kind of releases those same enzymes out into the world. All right. So we're going to talk about different kinds of. All right. So this is just talking about autotrophs versus heterotrophs. So I think we talked about this before. All right. So among consumers, right, there's different kinds of consumers, right? You can have herbivores that eat only plants, carnivores that eat only meat, and then omnivores eat both. Right?
Both plants and meat, right?
Yeah, both plants and animals, right? So carnivores are things like lions and stuff like that. Obviously, the rabbit is over here, herbivore. Omnivores could be like human beings or like bears, right? So bears, they eat a lot of like berries and all these other kinds of things that are not animals, right? Now, we talked about we're talking about decomposers, right? So decomposers are basically when something dies, right? The decomposer turns it back into the soil, back into nutrients. So therefore, other organisms can use them again, right? So there's two kinds of decomposers. There's what are called detrivores and saprotrophs. So for example, this beetle is going to be a detrivore, right? So does anyone know what this term, what detri or anything like that first prefix represents? Detri. Any idea what that prefix could indicate?
Oh, like destruction, whether detrimental, whether
Detrimental?
destructive.
So usually it means like teeth. It has something to do with teeth. So
To do with tea?
teeth, yeah.
With chai, tea.
No,
Or is that the tea? Whether you're talking about chai, like tea?
no, not tea. Teeth, like what you chew with.
Teeth.
Right.
Teeth. Oh.
Teeth. Teeth.
Okay, teeth.
Right. So
Oh, like dentistry, I guess. Detry. I don't know.
yeah, something like that. So detrivores are things like wood lice and beetles. So they're actually basically are basically like chewing things and eating them, right? So if it has like a mouth, basically it's a detrivore, right? It's a decomposer because it's eating dead things, right? But it has a mouth. Saprotrophs do not have a mouth. So these are things like mushrooms, things like bacteria, stuff like that, right? Bacteria and fungi. So they don't have like a literal mouth. What they do is that they secrete the enzymes outside, right? They take the enzymes that break food down and secrete it outside. So outside of their own body, the enzymes break down the food, and then they go near it and they just absorb all the nutrients that have been broken down. All right. So you could kind of think of it as like their stomach is kind of like on the outside, in a certain sense. Right. So this is just giving you some examples of detrivores and saprotrophs, right? So the ones at the bottom, right, they basically feed on others via internal digestion. So they have to have some kind of mouth or something to chew on something and take in the food, right? So they can undergo internal digestion. The ones on the outside, they have external digestion, right? They digest the food outside. And then the nutrients that result, the broken down nutrients that result, then they just take those in. They just absorb those in. So I think a lot of this we talked about, but they're going to be talking about food webs and flow of energy. So remember, only about 10% of the energy from one trophic level transfers to the next. So remember that picture we were talking about, right? 2,000, then next 200, then 20, then 2, right? So at every level, only 10%, 10%, 10% goes to the next level. So most of it is kind of like wasted as heat, right? So saying, for example, grass gains 100% of its energy from the sun, but it uses most of it for the processes it requires for life. So when a rabbit eats the grass, only 10% of it is left for it to use, right? And so on. So when the wolf eats the rabbit, only 10% of that energy that the rabbit took in is available for the wolf.
Brother, can you repeat that one more time? I don't really understand.
So it's saying that, let's suppose the bottom level here, right, took in 100 kilocalories of energy, right? So the next level that comes and eats this level is only going to be able to take 10% of that energy, so only 10 kilocalories. And then the next level.
Oh, so it's like basically they decrease because the energy that the plant produced, it uses some of that energy, right? And then like the remaining energy starts down.
Right. So whatever level you're at, that organism has basically used up most of that energy. And only 10% of its energy goes to the next level when the next level comes and eats it. All right. And this is basically showing the same kind of thing, the 10% rule, right? Every time you go up, only 10% gets transferred up. From that energy, only 10% gets transferred up, and so on. All right, this is just showing it like an example of a food chain. Right, at the bottom we have buffalo grass. The prairie dog eats it. The coyote eats the prairie dog. The vulture eats the coyote. So only 10% is transferred to the next level. All right. So food chains versus food webs, right? So I think we basically kind of talked about this already. So when it comes to a food web, right, it's a lot more complicated. So for example, all right. So here's what it's saying, right? So let's suppose we have a population of hawks, right? So the hawks are going to eat the herbivores, the mice, squirrels, rabbits, and birds, right? So the hawks are going to eat them. So let's suppose the number of hawks, just starts to decrease, right? So what's going to happen to the herbivores?
Basically, the herbivores are going to start overpopulating.
So you're going to start increasing in number, right?
Yeah.
However, what happens eventually, right? Are the number of mice just going to keep? Let's suppose all the hawks go away, right? There's no more hawks. So what's going to happen to the number of squirrels and mice? Is their number going to continue to increase and increase and increase forever because there's nothing to stop it?
No, because there are probably other like animals that eat mice and squirrels.
Mm-hmm. So it could be, but even if we take away all the predators, right? The food that they eat is going to run out, right?
Yeah, the food that they're going to run out, they're going to overpopulate, start dying from hunger.
Right, exactly right. So the supply of producers is going to dwindle, and then the number of herbivores is going to have to go down as well. So this just gives me an example of a food web, right? So you can kind of see that it's a lot more complicated than like a food chain because there's a lot more interactions, going along here. All right, this is kind of the same thing. I think just like another way of looking at it. So a food chain is simple. A food web branches out in many directions, right? So in a food chain, the arrows only point in one direction. In a food web, they're pointing in all different directions. So this is more like a web, like a spider's web. And I think that was it. Yeah.
Well, that's an easy lesson, brother. Easy lesson.